My name is Claire. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been known as reliable, the kind of person people describe with a nod rather than a story. I work in a professional office environment. Nothing dramatic on the surface. Spreadsheets, meetings, deadlines, polite smiles. If you ask my colleagues who I was, they'd probably say I was calm, competent, maybe a little quiet, someone who never caused problems, someone who could always be counted on to pick up the slack. What they wouldn't say, what they never really noticed, is how easy it was to mistake my silence for acceptance. I've always been underestimated in soft ways, not openly dismissed, not loudly criticized, just gently overlooked. Ideas absorbed and repeated by someone else. Extra work handed to me without discussion. Decisions made in rooms I wasn't invited into, even when they affected my job directly. None of it felt cruel enough to protest. And that's part of why this story matters. This is not a story about revenge. There's no shouting match, no dramatic walkout, no viral moment where everyone claps. I'm not here to expose anyone or paint myself as a hero. I didn't quit in anger. I didn't burn bridges. What I did was quieter and much more permanent. This story is about what happens when you slowly realize that being easy to work with has turned into being easy to ignore. About the moment you understand that loyalty, when it's one-sided, becomes a liability, and about the long, invisible process of reclaiming yourself, not by fighting louder, but by thinking more clearly. Over the next hour, I'm going to walk you through how I went from being the dependable background presence to someone who made an undeniable impact simply by stepping out of the role that had been assigned to me. You'll hear about small moments most people would forget, subtle shifts in behavior that didn't register as red flags at the time, the internal negotiations we make with ourselves to stay patient, to stay professional, to not be difficult. And you'll hear how silence, when chosen intentionally, can become a form of leverage. There's no villain in this story, no cartoon boss, no evil coworker, just ordinary people responding to incentives, habits, and the unspoken permission we sometimes give them to take more than they should. I'm telling it honestly, without embellishment, because I think many of us have lived some version of it, especially in workplaces where being agreeable is rewarded right up until it costs you something essential. If you're listening because you've ever felt invisible at work, if you've ever wondered whether staying quiet was strength or self-erasure, then this story is for you. Before we go any further, let me ask you something gently, without judgment. Have you ever stayed in a situation longer than you should have? Not because you were weak, but because you were trying to be fair. To them, I was steady background noise. Not in a negative way, not at first. More like the hum of a system that always worked. I was the person whose emails were clear, whose deadlines were never missed, whose presence in a meeting meant things would move forward without friction. If someone forgot something, I remembered. If something broke, I fixed it quietly. I didn't announce my effort. I assumed it was visible. At work, visibility and volume are often confused. I didn't confuse them. I simply didn't participate. In meetings, I spoke when I had something precise to add. No filler, no rehearsed confidence. I noticed early on that when I spoke less, people listened more closely, or at least I thought they did. What I didn't realize was that listening doesn't always mean crediting. Sometimes it just means harvesting. My job title sounded important enough to outsiders, but internally, I was seen as support. Dependable, adaptable, flexible. Words that sound like praise but function like instructions. They meant I could be leaned on, shifted, extended. Asked to help out just this once, again and again. I was rarely excluded outright. That would have been obvious. Instead, I was included in ways that felt slightly off. Copied on emails after decisions had already been made. Invited to meetings where outcomes were framed as fates accomplis. Thanked warmly for work that had clearly been assumed rather than requested. If you asked my manager about me, he would have said, "Claire's great. She doesn't need much oversight," which sounded like trust. What it actually meant was distance. Colleagues came to me with problems they didn't want to raise themselves. I became the safe place for unfinished thinking. I listened, I clarified, I organized. And then I watched as those same ideas reappeared later, polished, rephrased, delivered by someone else with more confidence in their voice and less history in the details. I told myself it didn't matter. The work was getting done, the team was succeeding, I had stability, I had a paycheck. I had the quiet satisfaction of knowing things ran because I was there. That story worked for a long time. What I didn't see, what I couldn't see yet, was how a role, once assigned, hardens. How do people stop updating their perception of you if you never disrupt it? I was the reliable one, which meant I was never the risky choice, but also never the bold one. Never the face, never the future. No one woke up one day and decided to overlook me. It happened incrementally, through patterns so subtle they felt reasonable, through my own willingness to absorb inconvenience to keep things smooth, through my silence when a correction felt too small to be worth the tension. I wasn't invisible, I was translucent. People could see me, but only through the function I served. My value was contextual, useful, not essential, replaceable in theory, though inconvenient in practice. And here's the hardest truth to admit. I helped build that version of myself. Not because I lacked confidence, but because I believed professionalism meant containment. That if I stayed calm, stayed fair, stayed patient, recognition would follow naturally. I thought time alone would correct the imbalance. Instead, time normalized it. This is who I was to them before anything broke, before anything shifted, before I understood that being underestimated isn't always an accident, and that staying quiet is only virtuous if it doesn't cost you your voice. The first moment didn't feel important at the time. That's what makes it dangerous. It happened during a routine meeting, one of those weekly check-ins where nothing major is supposed to change. I had spent the previous 2 days untangling a process issue that had been quietly slowing down an entire client workflow. It wasn't glamorous work, just careful tracking, comparison, and a few uncomfortable realizations about where things were breaking. When it was my turn to speak, I explained the issue simply. I didn't dramatize it. I outlined what was happening, why it mattered, and what I thought the fix should be. A small adjustment. Preventive, not reactive. There was a pause, not an awkward one, just enough silence for my words to land. Then the conversation moved on. No questions, no acknowledgement, not even a polite, let's circle back. I remember blinking once, checking my notes, and wondering if I'd explained it poorly. Maybe it sounded too technical. Maybe they needed time to digest it. 10 minutes later, someone else, one of the louder voices in the room, brought up a concern about delays in that same workflow. He framed it as something he'd been thinking about. He didn't mention my explanation or my proposed solution. He spoke in broader terms, with more urgency and fewer specifics. This time, the room reacted. People leaned in, questions were asked, concerns were voiced. The manager nodded, visibly engaged. Someone suggested we look into adjusting the process, which was exactly what I had just said. I felt something then, not anger, not embarrassment, more like a small internal recoil. A quiet recalibration. I remember thinking, that's strange, not unfair, just strange. I told myself it was a coincidence, that he hadn't connected his comment to mine. The timing was unfortunate. That credit didn't matter as much as outcomes. I even felt a flicker of relief. At least the issue was being addressed. But something had shifted. After the meeting, no one mentioned my earlier contribution, not to thank me, not to follow up. The action items were assigned and I was included. Of course I was. I always was. But now I was included as execution, not origin. Later that afternoon, my manager stopped by my desk. He said, "Good catch on that process issue. Let's make sure we document it this time." Good catch. Not your idea. Not you raised this. Just good catch. Like I'd stumbled across it accidentally. I smiled. I said, "Of course." I even felt proud that he'd noticed it all. That night, I replayed the meeting in my head. Not obsessively, just enough to understand it. I wondered if I should have spoken up when the idea resurfaced. If I should have said, "Yes, that's what I mentioned earlier." The sentence formed easily in my mind. It would have been calm, professional, accurate. I didn't say it. I told myself it would sound defensive, or petty, or like I was fishing for recognition. I reminded myself that I wasn't there for credit. I was there to do good work. But a question had lodged itself quietly in me. If I don't name my contributions, who will? Over the next few weeks, variations of the same thing happened. Nothing dramatic, just small omissions, my input paraphrased. My warnings softened. My solutions delayed until they were delivered by someone else with more authority in their voice. Each time, I noticed. Each time, I let it go. I became very good at explaining these moments away. It's a skill, really, rationalizing discomfort in the name of harmony. Telling yourself that being flexible is maturity, that not needing validation is strength. But the body remembers what the mind dismisses. I started bringing my black notebook into meetings more intentionally, writing down who said what, when ideas appeared, how decisions were framed. Not to build a case, at least not consciously. More like I needed proof that I wasn't imagining things. Because the first small cut isn't painful, it's confusing. And confusion, when repeated, teaches you to doubt yourself before you doubt the pattern. Once you explain something away enough times, it starts to feel normal. That's how it happened for me, not with a single betrayal, but with a slow adjustment of expectations. I stopped expecting acknowledgement, stopped expecting inclusion at the beginning of decisions instead of the end, stopped expecting my role to expand just because my responsibilities had. I didn't think of it as disrespect. That word felt too strong, too emotional. I thought of it as an organizational reality. Some people were visible, some people were useful. I happened to be useful. The meetings began to follow a familiar rhythm. I would prepare thoroughly, anticipating questions before they were asked. I'd share insights carefully, framing them as support rather than direction. And the room would respond selectively, engaging more when my points were echoed by someone else, nodding politely when they came directly from me. I noticed that when I spoke with certainty, it made some people uncomfortable, not threatened, just unsettled, as if confidence from someone like me disrupted an unspoken hierarchy. So I softened my language, added qualifiers, turned statements into suggestions. It felt strategic at the time. What I didn't realize was that I was training people how to treat me. Work piled up in quiet ways. Extra responsibilities appeared without discussion, framed as trust. You're so good at this. We know we can count on you. Compliments that arrived bundled with expectation. And because I could do the work, I did. I told myself I was investing, building credibility, creating leverage for later. Later, it kept moving. When deadlines were tight, my calendar filled. When things went smoothly, the credit floated upward. When something went wrong, I was looped in early because I was safe, because I wouldn't react, because I would fix it. I became the person people leaned on and stepped over in the same motion. The hardest part was that no one was overtly unkind. That made it almost impossible to challenge. You can confront cruelty, you can name injustice, but how do you push back against politeness, against smiles and reasonable explanations, and the constant implication that you're lucky to be trusted? So I adjusted myself instead. I worked a little later, answered emails a little faster, smoothed over issues before they reached leadership. I absorbed tension so others didn't have to. I told myself this was what professionalism looked like. At home, I felt strangely tired, not burned out, just dimmed. Like I was expending energy without momentum. I couldn't point to anything wrong, but something was off. My work mattered, but I didn't feel like I did. There were moments when I almost spoke up, when I almost said, I'd like to be included earlier, or, I've been handling this scope for a while now. Can we revisit my role? The words came, hovered, then dissolved. I didn't want to sound resentful. I didn't want to disrupt the image of being easy to work with. I didn't want to risk being seen as difficult after years of being dependable. So I normalized the imbalance. I told myself that respect wasn't about recognition, that contribution was its own reward, that staying calm was a virtue, not avoidance. But something subtle was happening beneath that narrative. Each time I stayed quiet when something felt misaligned, I felt a small internal contraction, a tightening, like I was folding myself slightly smaller to fit the space that had been left for me. I started to notice how others introduced me. This is Claire, she helps us keep things organized. Not leads, not drives, helps. And I smiled every time. The notebook is filled with observations, not accusations, just patterns. Repetition has a way of clarifying things that single moments can't. Eventually, I had to admit something uncomfortable. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was a system. And systems don't change unless something disrupts them. At that point, I still believed disruption meant confrontation, a conversation, a boundary, a firm but respectful assertion of value. I was wrong. Before anything external changed, something else had to happen first. Something quieter, something internal. Because as long as I kept accepting the role I'd been given, everyone else had permission to keep me there. It became clear to me one afternoon, not in a meeting, not in conflict, but in a passing comment that wasn't meant to mean anything at all. We were wrapping up a project review, the kind where leadership thanked everyone in broad strokes, highlighting a few names, summarizing outcomes. As people gathered their things, my manager smiled and said, almost casually, "Claire's great at keeping everything together. We'd be lost without her." Everyone nodded. Someone laughed lightly. It was meant as praise. But something in me went still, keeping everything together, not shaping direction, not leading strategy, holding things in place so others could move freely. I suddenly saw it clearly, not just how they described me, but how they used me. I wasn't being prepared for advancement. I was being positioned as infrastructure. Infrastructure isn't consulted. It's relied upon, maintained, taken for granted until it fails. Once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. I thought back over the past few years and noticed how consistent the pattern was. New initiatives came and went, always with someone else's name attached. I was involved early enough to do the groundwork, late enough to never own the outcome. When I expressed interest in expanding my scope, the response was always reassuring and vague. "You're doing such important work already. We need you exactly where you are right now. Let's revisit this after the next cycle." The next cycle always arrived with new priorities and the same assumptions. The role I was assigned wasn't written anywhere. It lived in expectations, in tone, in the way decisions happened without me, and responsibilities landed on me anyway. I was the steady center that allowed everyone else to take risks, and I had agreed to it, quietly, repeatedly, not because I lacked ambition, but because I believed effort would eventually be recognized. That fairness was cumulative, that someone would notice the imbalance and correct it. That belief was comforting. It also kept me still. Once I understood the role, I started noticing how carefully it was protected. When I tried to step outside it, by questioning a direction or proposing something bolder, the response was subtle resistance, a raised eyebrow, a reminder of timelines, a suggestion that I focus on what I do best. No one said I couldn't do more, they just never made room for it. And the truth was, I didn't fit the story they had of me anymore, not because I had changed, but because I had outgrown it. They still saw the version of me who would stay late without being asked, who would smooth tensions instead of naming them, who would carry weight quietly so others wouldn't have to. Understanding that hurt more than the earlier dismissals, because it meant the problem wasn't a single person or moment. It was the identity I had been allowed to inhabit. I went home that night and sat with that realization. Not angrily, honestly. I asked myself when I had last advocated for myself without cushioning it for someone else's comfort. I couldn't remember. That was the moment I stopped waiting to be seen differently. Not because I was angry, because I was clear. I didn't want to be the glue anymore. I wanted to be a decision maker. Or at the very least, I wanted my absence to matter as much as my presence did. But I also knew this. Announcing that shift wouldn't work. Roles like mine aren't changed by declarations. They're changed by absence, by reallocation, by the consequences that unfold quietly. I didn't know yet what I was going to do. I only knew that continuing as I was would mean accepting a future where I stayed essential but invisible. And I wasn't willing to do that anymore. The shift didn't happen during a conflict. There was no confrontation, no raised voice, no dramatic decision made in the heat of emotion. It happened on a morning that looked exactly like every other one. I arrived early, as usual. The office was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels neutral rather than lonely. I set my bag down, opened my laptop, and pulled out my black notebook. I flipped to a page I hadn't intended to revisit, one filled with observations from the past year, dates, meetings, decisions, small notes written in a steady hand. Seeing them all together did something to me. For the first time, I stopped asking whether I was overreacting. Patterns don't require interpretation. They just require acknowledgement. That morning, I had been scheduled to present an update to leadership, an overview of operational risks I'd been tracking. It was important work, but framed narrowly. I was there to inform, not to influence. As I reviewed my slides, I realized something quietly devastating. I had already solved half the problems I was about to present. Not in theory, in practice. I had the data, the process changes, the proof, but I wasn't expected to own any of it. My role was to surface issues, not to drive solutions. I closed the presentation, not permanently, just long enough to sit with that realization. I thought about how often I had waited for permission to expand, how often I had deferred, adjusted, softened myself so others wouldn't feel challenged. And I saw clearly that no one was going to offer me the role I wanted, because the system was working exactly as designed. The shift was internal, but it was decisive. I stopped thinking in terms of fairness and started thinking in terms of structure. Not who's wrong, but what incentives are in place. Not, why don't they see me, but what happens if I stop making this easy. I gave the presentation that day as requested. Calm, clear, professional, no disruption. But something was different. I wasn't invested in being understood anymore. I was invested in understanding. I listened more than I spoke. I watched how decisions were framed, who carried authority, who was protected from consequences, and who absorbed them. I noticed which risks mattered only when leadership felt them directly. That afternoon, my manager stopped by again. He said, "Great work today. You always keep us ahead of problems." I thanked him. And for the first time, the compliment didn't land as validation. It landed as confirmation. That was the day I stopped equating praise with progress. Nothing outward changed. I didn't push back. I didn't withdraw. I didn't announce any boundaries. But internally, I disengaged from one thing: the need to be seen as indispensable in the way they preferred. Instead, I became precise. I started asking myself a new set of questions. Which of my responsibilities were truly recognized? Which were assumed? Which created visibility and which created dependency? I stopped volunteering information automatically. I shared what was required, nothing more. I wasn't punishing anyone. I was observing. That day marked the end of something subtle but profound: the belief that endurance alone would earn me a different outcome. I realized I didn't need to be louder. I needed to be strategic. And strategy begins with restraint. After that day, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been reflexive, a habit shaped by politeness, by professionalism, by the belief that not everything needed to be said. Now it was deliberate, measured, chosen. I didn't withdraw. I didn't disengage. From the outside, I looked exactly the same calm demeanor, same reliability, same steady output. That was important. Silence only works if it doesn't announce itself. But internally, I was no longer cushioning the system. When small issues arose, I documented them instead of quietly fixing them. When decisions were made without context, I asked clarifying questions, once. If answers were vague, I noted that too. I stopped filling in gaps that weren't officially mine to fill. People mistook this for passivity. In meetings, I spoke less, but when I did, my words were cleaner, shorter, harder to misinterpret. I stopped offering preemptive explanations. I let questions sit unanswered if they weren't directed at me. At first, no one noticed. Then they noticed, but misread it. "You've been really focused lately," someone said approvingly. "I know you're juggling a lot," another offered. "You're so steady under pressure," my manager remarked. They thought I was absorbing more. In reality, I was absorbing less and recording more. I watched how quickly people grew uncomfortable when I didn't rescue conversations, when I didn't reframe someone else's confusion, when I didn't step in to translate between teams. Small silences widened. Minor inefficiencies surfaced. And still, no one blamed me. That's the irony of being underestimated. Your absence isn't immediately attributed to you. My notebook became less about emotion and more about structure, dependencies, ownership gaps, informal expectations that had never been formalized. I could see how much of the organization's stability rested on unwritten labor people assumed would always be there. I didn't correct that assumption. I also began paying attention to myself, to how often I'd previously overridden my own discomfort to maintain smoothness, to how much energy that had cost me. Choosing silence gave some of that energy back. Not all silence is surrender. Some of it is alignment. There were moments when speaking up would have been easy and satisfying, when I could have corrected someone, clarified a misconception, reclaimed credit. I didn't, because I was no longer trying to change how I was perceived. I was preparing to change what would happen next. The workplace didn't become hostile, it became revealing. People who had relied on me without realizing it started to falter in small ways. Deadlines slipped. Questions circled without landing. Processes that had seemed effortless now required meetings. Still, no one connected it to me. That's what happens when your contribution has been treated as background. When it disappears, people blame the weather. I wasn't testing them. I was observing consequences. And I was learning something essential. Silence, when intentional, creates space. Space exposes structure. Structure determines power. This wasn't about proving anything. It was about understanding where my leverage actually was, and how much of it had been invisible because I had made myself so available. By choosing when not to speak, I finally started hearing the system clearly. What they never noticed was how much I was learning while I stayed quiet. When you're not trying to be seen, you have time to see everything else. I began mapping the organization the way you might map a city. Not by titles, but by movement. Who approvals flowed through, where decisions stalled, which processes existed only because someone like me had been maintaining them manually for years. I could see which roles were symbolic and which were structural. I stopped thinking of my job as a list of tasks and started seeing it as a network of dependencies. Every system has pressure points, not weaknesses, just places where stress accumulates. I knew them all, not because I was looking for leverage, but because I had been the one relieving that pressure for so long. I also began documenting more formally. Not emotionally, not defensively, just accurately. Meeting notes, follow-ups, confirmation emails, process ownership clarifications. I asked questions in writing instead of in passing. I summarized decisions after they were made, neutrally, and shared them with the group. Nothing aggressive, nothing confrontational. Just clarity. That alone changed things. People became more careful about what they promised when it was visible. Ambiguity started to feel heavier. I noticed some colleagues subtly redirecting work away from me, not because they were upset, but because it was easier to continue operating in vagueness elsewhere. That told me something important. The value I provided wasn't just execution, it was coherence. And coherence, when removed, creates friction. I also invested in myself quietly. I reviewed my contract, my job description, the boundaries of my official role versus what I actually did. The gap was substantial. I updated my documentation, not as a threat, as a mirror. I learned which parts of my work were replaceable and which weren't. Which knowledge lived only in my head. Which systems had no redundancy. Which decisions I had been quietly making without authority but with full accountability. None of this felt dramatic, it felt clarifying. I realized how often organizations confuse loyalty with silence, and how risky that is, for everyone. There was a moment late one evening when I looked at my notebook and understood something that made my chest feel strangely calm. If I left tomorrow, things wouldn't collapse. But they would slow, they would strain, they would become visible in ways they hadn't been before. That mattered, not because I wanted chaos, but because it meant my value was real, even if it had been minimized. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. I didn't hint. I didn't posture. I just kept preparing. I made sure my work was traceable, that my contributions were documented, that ownership was clear where it had once been assumed. I built quiet boundaries into my days. I stopped compensating for others' lack of clarity, and I watched. What they never noticed was that their ease depended on my invisibility. That by staying quiet, I wasn't shrinking, I was repositioning. They still thought of me as the dependable constant. They didn't see the infrastructure slowly becoming visible. They didn't see the system beginning to notice itself. And they certainly didn't see the moment when my understanding crossed a threshold, from awareness into certainty. Because once you know where the structure rests, you no longer need permission to step out from under it. The reveal didn't come from someone else. There was no email, no meeting, no sudden confession from leadership. It came late one evening, alone, with my laptop open and my notebook beside it. I had been reviewing a process document I'd created years earlier, something so embedded into daily operations that no one thought of it as authored anymore. It had been revised, adapted, and layered with exceptions, but the core logic was still mine. I followed the thread forward, step by step, and realized how many downstream decisions depended on assumptions that had never been formally approved. Assumptions I had been quietly maintaining. That was the moment it clicked, not emotionally, but structurally. I wasn't just supporting the system, I was stabilizing it. And stability, unlike visibility, is noticed only when it's gone. I felt no rush of excitement, no sense of triumph, just a deep, settling clarity, like finally understanding the shape of a room you've been in for years, with the lights off. My leverage wasn't dramatic, it wasn't explosive, it was cumulative. It lived in a process of ownership that had never been redistributed, in knowledge that hadn't been transferred because there was never enough time, in responsibilities that had expanded without corresponding authority, in the quiet trust that if something complex needed to be handled carefully, it would somehow land with me. That trust was informal, which meant it was fragile. I realized then that I had been protecting others from the consequences of their own shortcuts, not maliciously, just habitually, and by doing so, I had removed any incentive for the structure to change. The reveal wasn't that they need me. They rely on what I've been silently absorbing. There's a difference. Needing a person invites negotiation. relying on invisible labor creates blindness. I also saw something else, equally important. I had options. Not impulsive ones, not dramatic exits, but legitimate, ethical, professional choices. Paths that didn't require confrontation or explanation, only consistency. I could redefine my role simply by adhering to its actual boundaries. I could request formal ownership of what I already manage. I could step away from responsibilities that had never been acknowledged. Or eventually, I could leave without unraveling anything, because I had documented, clarified, and stabilized first. For the first time, staying or leaving felt like a decision, not a trap. That was the private reveal. I wasn't stuck. I had just been quiet. And quiet, when chosen without awareness, feels like resignation. When chosen with clarity, it becomes power. I closed my laptop that night without making a plan. I didn't need one yet. Knowing the truth was enough for the moment, I slept deeply. The next day, nothing looked different, but everything felt different. I no longer interpreted interactions personally. When something was dismissed, I noted it. When something was deferred, I accepted it without internal negotiation. My self-worth was no longer tied to their recognition. That freed up something essential: patience. I wasn't waiting for justice. I was preparing for alignment. The reveal didn't make me want to act immediately. It made me want to act correctly. To choose the option that would end the pattern, not inflame it. I understood then that the most effective changes in power dynamics often happen without witnesses. And once you see your leverage clearly, you don't rush. You respect it. Once you see your options clearly, indecision becomes its own kind of choice. I spent several weeks in what looked, from the outside, like total stillness. I did my work, I attended meetings, I met deadlines. Nothing in my behavior suggested change. Internally, though, I was weighing paths. I could ask for a role adjustment, formal recognition, expanded authority, a title that reflected the scope I was already carrying. It was a reasonable option, clean, professional. It would require a conversation, perhaps several. It would also require me to believe that the system was ready to re-see me. I could continue as I was, now with awareness, using my leverage quietly, and protecting myself better. That path offered safety, familiarity, and the risk of slow erosion, because once you see the imbalance, tolerating it costs more. Or I could choose the irreversible option, not impulsively, not dramatically, but deliberately. The option that wouldn't require convincing anyone of my value. The one that would simply make the structure respond to reality. I thought about timing, about responsibility, about the people who depended on the systems I maintained, not emotionally, but operationally. I didn't want chaos. I didn't want to prove a point at someone else's expense. That mattered to me. I also thought about myself, about how many years I had spent compressing my expectations, about how often I had accepted reassurance instead of clarity, about the quiet cost of staying somewhere you've already outgrown. The decision point wasn't about anger. It was about self-respect. One evening, after work, I sat with my notebook and wrote a single sentence on a clean page. What outcome would make this pattern impossible to repeat? The answer surprised me with its simplicity. Not a confrontation, not an apology, not even recognition. A structural change. I chose the path that would remove me from the role I had been assigned without asking permission to redefine it. That didn't mean quitting on the spot. It meant preparing an exit that was ethical, contained, and aligned with my values. One that didn't rely on blame, but on boundaries. Once the decision was made, the noise stopped. Doubt faded. Not because the future was certain, but because the direction was. I wasn't leaving in reaction. I was leaving with intention. I didn't tell anyone yet. Decisions like that don't need witnesses in their early stages. They need integrity. I gave myself a timeline. I continued documenting. I ensured continuity where it was appropriate. I respected the work, even as I detached from the role it had trapped me in. There was a strange peace in that phase. Knowing I wasn't waiting anymore. Knowing I wasn't hoping for a shift that might never come. I had chosen myself without making a scene. That's the thing about irreversible decisions. Once they're made, you stop negotiating internally. Your energy stops leaking into hypotheticals. You become precise. And precision is powerful. Once the decision was made, everything became quieter. Not externally. Externally, nothing changed at all. But inside me, there was no more internal debate. No more rehearsed conversations. No more imagining how things might improve. I was moving forward. I treated the process the way I treated everything else, with care. I reviewed my contract line by line. Notice periods, obligations, non-negotiables. I made sure I understood exactly what I owed and what I didn't. There's a clarity that comes from reading your agreements without emotion. I organized my documentation with the same precision I'd always applied to my work. Processes were written clearly. Ownership was defined where it could be. Open questions were surfaced and recorded, not resolved quietly. I didn't overperform. I performed accurately. When people asked for help outside my formal scope, I responded politely and directed them to the appropriate channel. No explanation, no apology, just consistency. It took longer for anyone to notice than you might expect. That's the paradox of invisible labor. When you stop providing it, people assume it's still happening until friction accumulates. I also took care of myself in ways I hadn't before. I left on time. I stopped checking emails late at night, not as a statement, just as a boundary. The work fits into my life again instead of the other way around. There was no rush, no countdown, just steady movement. In meetings, I listened more than ever, not to absorb responsibility, but to understand where misunderstandings were forming. I clarified things in writing. I avoided verbal commitments that couldn't be tracked. People still described me the same way, calm, dependable, unflappable. They had no idea. What I was doing wasn't secretive. It was simply private. I didn't want allies. I didn't want sympathy. I wanted alignment. There were moments when someone would say, "We'll figure it out, Claire always does." And I would smile because I knew that sentence was quietly expiring. Not because I was withdrawing out of spite, but because I was no longer available to be the unacknowledged solution. Moving in silence requires restraint. It means resisting the urge to explain yourself before you're asked. It means letting people experience the system as it actually is, not as you've been holding it together. I wasn't sabotaging anything. I was allowing reality to surface, and reality has a way of rebalancing things, whether people like it or not. By the time the first signs of strain appeared, my path was already set. The consequences didn't arrive as a crisis. They arrived as an inconvenience. Small things at first, a deadline that slipped by a day, a meeting that ended without resolution, an email thread that went longer than it should have because no one quite knew who was responsible for the next step. No alarms, no accusations, just friction. I noticed it before anyone else did, not with satisfaction, but with a kind of detached recognition. This was what the system looked like without my quiet corrections. People began asking more questions in meetings, not strategic ones, clarifying ones, things I used to answer automatically. I waited until I was asked directly, then responded precisely. No extra context, no anticipatory fixes. Someone joked, "Wow, things feel more complicated lately." Another said, "We should really tighten up these processes." I agreed. Still, no one connected the dots. My manager seemed slightly more tense. He asked for updates more frequently. He CC'd more people. He scheduled check-ins that felt reactive rather than intentional. In one meeting, a decision stalled because no one could confidently explain how a change would ripple through the system. I had that knowledge. I always had. I shared only what was necessary to answer the specific question at hand. The room felt unsettled, not angry, just uncertain. That's when I realized how much emotional labor I'd been carrying without recognizing it. I had been the translator, the stabilizer, the person who made complexity feel manageable. Without that, things felt heavier. People began revisiting old decisions, second-guessing paths that had once seemed straightforward. More time was spent aligning, less time moving. No one blamed me. That wasn't how it worked. They blamed the workload, the timeline, external factors. But they felt the loss of ease. One afternoon, a colleague stopped by and said, "Hey, can you take a look at this? I'm not sure how it fits into the bigger picture." I asked calmly, "What part are you unsure about?" He hesitated. "Well, all of it, I guess." That was new. I guided him to the documentation I'd created months earlier. He skimmed it, surprised. "When did we write this?" "We," I said evenly, "have had it for a while." He nodded slowly. "I didn't realize." That phrase came up more often after that. I didn't realize. The consequences weren't punitive. They were educational. And still, I didn't accelerate anything. I didn't reveal my plans. I didn't signal departure. The system needed to feel the change on its own terms. By the time leadership acknowledged that something felt off, it wasn't a single event they could point to. It was an accumulation. That's when you know a shift is real. By the time the concern became explicit, the window for easy repair had already closed. It started with a meeting request from my manager, one-on-one, short notice, neutral, subject line. I recognized the tone immediately, not alarmed, not accusatory, just attentive in a way he hadn't been before. He asked how I was doing, really doing. He mentioned that things felt more complex lately, that some processes seemed harder to move through than expected. He framed it as curiosity, not criticism. I listened. Then he asked a question that months earlier might have felt validating. Is there anything you think we should be doing differently? It was a fair question. It was also late. I answered honestly but carefully. I spoke about clarity, about ownership, about how much depended on informal knowledge. I didn't position myself as the solution. I positioned the structure as the issue. He nodded, took notes, thanked me. Nothing changed. Over the next few weeks, similar conversations happened. Always polite, always exploratory. Leadership began using words like alignment and resilience. There were discussions about future-proofing and knowledge sharing. I had already done that work. What they were really responding to was discomfort. The system no longer felt effortless. And effort, once introduced, feels like a loss. I could sense the shift in tone, more urgency, fewer assumptions. People looped me in earlier again, not to assign work, but to ask for perspective. Invitations arrived that would have mattered 6 months earlier. They noticed me now, but noticing isn't the same as understanding. No one asked the question that mattered: why did this take so long? They were trying to restore the old equilibrium where I absorbed complexity quietly, without realizing that equilibrium depended on my consent, and I had already withdrawn it. There was a moment during a leadership meeting where someone said, "We should really make sure Claire is supported. She's been carrying a lot." It was meant kindly. It landed hollow. Support, offered only when strain becomes visible, isn't support. It's a response. By then, my decision had matured into certainty. I wasn't waiting for them to catch up. I wasn't hoping for acknowledgement. I wasn't even frustrated anymore. I had moved past the point where fixes mattered. The system wanted relief. I wanted resolution. And those aren't the same thing. When the conversations finally turned toward next steps and long-term growth, they were framed around continuity, how to keep things stable, not around change. I realized then that even now, they didn't see the role I had been playing. They just felt its absence. And absence doesn't negotiate. I stayed calm, cooperative, professional. I answered questions. I shared documentation. I did nothing to accelerate panic, because panic wasn't the point. Clarity was. And clarity had already arrived for me. The conversation happened on a Thursday afternoon, scheduled in advance, framed as a check-in. By then, I knew what it was. When I walked into the room, there was no tension in the air, no crossed arms, no urgency, just professionalism layered over unease. My manager started by acknowledging my contributions. He used careful language. He said the team had been reflecting on how much institutional knowledge I held, how important my role had been in maintaining continuity, how they wanted to make sure I felt valued. I listened without interrupting. Then he asked the question he'd been circling for weeks. "Can you tell me how you're feeling about your role here?" Months earlier, I might have softened the answer. I might have framed it as uncertainty, or growth curiosity, or timing. This time, I didn't. I said calmly, "I've outgrown the role as it's currently defined." No accusation, no history lesson, just a fact. The room went quiet, not defensively but attentively. He asked what that meant. I explained that over time, my responsibilities had expanded far beyond my formal scope, but my authority and recognition hadn't. That I had raised concerns in small ways before, but the structure hadn't shifted. That I no longer felt aligned with the role I was being asked to occupy. I didn't mention names, I didn't recount slights, I didn't raise my voice. I spoke about structure, not feelings. He asked what I wanted. A promotion, a new title, a revised mandate. I paused before answering, then I said, "I've already made a decision about my next step." That was the moment the tone changed, not dramatically, just perceptibly. He asked if I was saying I intended to leave. I nodded. There was no shock, just a recalibration. He asked if there was anything that could change my mind. I considered the question honestly. Then I said, "No, I don't think so." Because nothing could have been done, but because the time for doing it had passed. We talked through logistics, timelines, knowledge transfer. He asked if I'd be willing to help ensure a smooth transition. I agreed, not out of obligation, but because it aligned with how I wanted to leave. The conversation ended the way it began, politely, respectfully, without drama. When I walked back to my desk, I felt something unexpected, not relief, not triumph, lightness, not because I'd won anything, but because I had finally stopped explaining myself. The confrontation, if you could call it that, didn't burn anything down. It didn't need to. It simply marked the end of a misunderstanding that had gone on too long. After I gave notice, the atmosphere shifted again, but this time, it wasn't about tension. It was about distance. People were kind, respectful, slightly careful. They asked thoughtful questions. They thanked me more openly than they ever had before. Recognition arrived in a form that was almost ceremonial. It didn't move me, because who I am now isn't shaped by belated acknowledgement. In my final weeks, I did my work the same way I always had, thoroughly, cleanly, without resentment. I handed things over with clarity. I answered questions without guarding information. I left nothing messy behind. Not because I owed it to them, but because I owed it to myself. I noticed how often people said, "We didn't realize how much you were doing," and I realized something important. They didn't need to realize it for me to move on. That awareness wasn't my responsibility anymore. Who I am now is someone who understands the cost of being easy to overlook. Someone who knows that calm isn't the same as compliant. That patience, when unexamined, can turn into self-erasure. I didn't become harder, I became clearer. In my new role, different organization, different structure, I don't perform invisibility as professionalism. I speak early, I define ownership. I ask direct questions and wait for real answers. Not aggressively, just accurately. I still value fairness, still believe in doing good work, but I no longer confuse contribution with obligation. I don't stay quiet to preserve comfort that isn't mutual. And I don't wait to be seen. The biggest change isn't external, it's internal. I trust my perception now. When something feels misaligned, I don't rush to explain it away. I observe, I assess, and if needed, I act without resentment. I don't need dominance to be loud to be effective. Quiet, when chosen with clarity, is enough. Looking back, I don't regret staying as long as I did. That time taught me how systems work, and how easily good people disappear inside them. But I don't romanticize endurance anymore. Who I am now is someone who understands that reclaiming yourself doesn't require revenge. It requires alignment. And alignment, once chosen, changes everything. I didn't leave angry. That's the part people often expect, and the part they struggle to understand. They look for a breaking point, a dramatic injustice, a moment where everything became unbearable. But the truth is simpler and harder to explain. I left because I could finally see clearly. And once you see clearly, staying becomes a choice instead of a test. This story isn't about a bad workplace or cruel people. It's about what happens when quiet competence is mistaken for infinite capacity. When professionalism becomes a mask for self-sacrifice. When being agreeable slowly replaces being visible. There's a subtle lesson here, and it isn't speak up more or demand your worth. Those are slogans. Reality is more nuanced. The real lesson is this. Systems respond to structure, not intention. You can be patient, fair, and hardworking and still be overlooked if your role is designed that way. And no amount of endurance will change a structure that benefits from your silence. Reclaiming yourself doesn't always mean confronting someone. Sometimes it means withdrawing your consent to a pattern you never explicitly agreed to. Sometimes it means choosing alignment over approval. Sometimes it means leaving quietly, with integrity intact, and letting the system feel the absence it never acknowledged. I didn't quit because I was weak. I didn't quit because I was angry. I didn't quit because I failed. I reclaimed myself because I understood my value, and I refused to keep giving it away invisibly. If you take anything from this story, let it be this. Being calm does not require being small, and being fair does not mean staying where you are diminished. You're allowed to outgrow spaces that once felt safe. You're allowed to choose clarity over comfort, and you don't owe anyone an explanation that costs you your peace. I'll leave you with one question, one I wish I had asked myself sooner. Have you ever mistaken patience for strength? And what might change if you stopped? If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.
Cảm ơn các bạn vì đã theo dõi đến cuối. Đừng quên ấn like, share và bật chuông để không bỏ lỡ những video mới nhất nhé. Hẹn gặp lại.